My kids always mock me, as apparently I always say that every church is my favourite church. I think they're probably exaggerating just a little bit. However, if I were to make a list of my top 10 churches in East Anglia, which is without question a very hard task, the church at Thompson in Norfolk would be in my top 10. Indeed, I would even go as far as to put it in my top 3. Dedicated to St Martin of Tours, it is by no means the grandest of Norfolk churches architecturally. It is a building that has an unassuming air from the outside, but that exterior, as I will show you, belies an interior that is packed with character and atmosphere. Internally, the church has retained layer upon layer of its earlier furnishings, and through these, and with a bit of knowledge and imagination, you can catch a glimpse of a moment in time and the worship here in the past. Thompson is located in a relatively remote and sparsely populated bit of Norfolk known as the Breckland, a sandy heathland. It was this part of Norfolk that much of the flint that was used to build the churches of the county was quarried, and Thompson is 10 miles, as the crow flies, from Grimes Graves, where flint has been quarried since Neolithic times. The Martins is built primarily of this locally occurring flint, and is therefore perfectly at one with the landscape that it sits in. As well as being a wonderful building aesthetically, this building also has a fascinating and unusual history. For the last 2 centuries before the English Reformation, this wasn't just an ordinary parish church serving this remote rural village. It had another role. It was the church of a foundation called a Chantry college. In order for me to explain what such an institution is, I have to talk a little bit about medieval Catholic doctrine. An essential doctrine developed in the medieval Catholic West was the concept of purgatory. Indeed, it still remains a part of Catholic belief today. The word purgatory means to purify, and it is a place, or perhaps rather a state, there was a debate about that, where the souls of the dead are prepared for the bliss of heaven, of paradise, through a process of purification. People, of course, naturally and instinctively prayed for their departed loved ones and had no wish for them to remain in purgatory for very long. And so alongside this doctrine developed, rather organically, the idea that through the prayers of the living, the dead might receive some pardon from the pains of purgatory. In the later Middle Ages, people became increasingly anxious to ensure in their lifetime that a good provision was made for prayers for them after their death. Now, the prayers of individuals were of course desirable and beneficial, but to have a mass or masses celebrated for your soul by a priest was much more efficacious. The richer you were, of course, the greater the provision you could afford to make for your soul's health, and of course the richer you were, the more help you needed. If you were moderately wealthy, you might alienate either a small property or a sum of money to pay the stipend of a priest, who would then sing or chant masses for you for a time-limited period, say a year or even 5. Such an establishment where masses were chanted was known in medieval England as a chantry. If you had a bit more money and property to spare, you might create a more permanent establishment of this sort, alienating or purchasing land to found what was termed a perpetual chantry, the resources generated from that property supporting a priest forever. But in order to do that, you had to get a license from the king, so it was more expensive as lawyers were involved. If you were very wealthy, from say the upper gentry or the nobility, you might establish something a bit more grandiose, a chantry college with multiple priests living a common life and chanting mass for your soul, a secular version, if you like, of a monastery. And in 1349, the parish church of St Martin at Thompson became the home of a chantry college of this sort. 1349 was of course the year of the Black Death, and 2 brothers, Sir Thomas and Sir John de Chardelot, were granted a royal licence to alienate properties and establish a college at Thompson. The purpose of the college was to provide priests who would pray for the souls of their parents, Sir John Chardelot the Elder and Dame Agnes. And we know that the latter, Dame Agnes, died in 1349, most probably during the Great Pestilence. The de Chardelot family lived at Flempton near Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, but they owned the manor of Thompson, and it seems that they might well have originated there, and in fact the church acted as their family mausoleum for many generations, and Sir John the Elder and Dame Agnes and their sons are all buried in the church. The family were very rich indeed, and they made their money from the law. Sir John de Chardelot the Elder was a judge, and he was appointed to the Court of Common Pleas in the early 1320s, a court that dealt with civil disputes, and was therefore financially lucrative. The college at Thompson was established with a warden and 5 priests who lived together in a house to the south of the church. In the early 16th century, this college had a fairly substantial income, around £63 a year, and the community kept 3,000 sheep on the brecks surrounding the village. Now, the whole system of purgatory and of masses for pardon was one of the first aspects of Catholic culture to be attacked in the Protestant Reformation, and all chantries and soul masses were abolished in the 1550s. The college at Thompson was suppressed earlier in 1541 during the reign of Henry VIII, at which point St Martin's returned to being just an ordinary parish church. The present church building, there was presumably an older one on the site, was rebuilt either at the time or shortly after the founding of the college by the de Chardelots, and is a typical example of the decorated style of architecture, but I'll say more about that when we go inside. One of the wonderful things about St Martin's at Thompson is that it hasn't had a drastic Victorian tidying up and restoration, and that accounts for a lot of the building's very delightful atmosphere. The church was gently conserved in 1913 after it was threatened with closure and demolition. The work was undertaken primarily through the initiative and was partly financed by Prince Frederick Duleep Singh, the son of Duleep Singh, the last Maharaja of the Sikh Empire. Prince Frederick, who was a notable antiquary, spent much of his life in Norfolk. He was born and grew up at his father's estate at Elvedon, which is about 15 miles from Thompson, and later settled at Blow Norton Hall. He developed a strong interest in the preservation of Norfolk's churches. Looking east, the most prominent furnishing visually in the interior of the church is the medieval rood screen, standing underneath the chancel arch and dividing the nave from the chancel. It is quite an extraordinary piece. Most Norfolk church screens, and rather a lot actually survive, date from the 15th and 16th century, but this one is early. It is mid-14th century and was likely installed as part of the fitting out of the church following the foundation of the college. Now, I mentioned that the church is in what is generally termed the decorated style of architecture. This is a style of architectural design that is quite naturalistic. Window tracery, for example, rather than having regimented panelled lights as you find in the 15th century, is filled rather with flowing foliate forms. Sculpture and carving is also overlaid with oodles of sprays of foliage. The screen has all of those decorated characteristics, which is how we know it dates from the middle of the 14th century. The top part of the screen has a long band of tracery from end to end, composed of circular motifs. These are filled with trefoils or dagger-shaped elements that are called mouchés. Rood screens are divisions between the nave and the chancel of a church, but they are not like the Eastern Orthodox iconostasis which developed in Russia in the 16th century. They're not designed to block the view and keep people out. They are intentionally designed with the large openings in the centre of them that act like window frames through which the action of the Mass in the chancel at the high altar can be viewed. Late medieval Catholicism was a religion that put great emphasis on visual participation, particularly in the action of the Mass. This lovely old screen still has much of its original painted decoration adhered to the aged timber, The bottom of the screen, known as the dado, is painted white and stylized sprays of leaves and flower heads have been stenciled on its surface. Above this is a series of slender pillars supporting the tracery, and these have been painted striped white and blue. The tracery itself was once painted a vibrant red ochre with gilding. Timber was rarely left unpainted in churches in the Middle Ages. Now beyond the screen is the chancel, which was the place where the community of priests would have conducted the daily round of prayer and the masses for the souls of the founders. It's also probably where the founders of the Chardelots are buried, though no monuments to them survive. One of the knock-on effects of this chantry system is that it greatly increased the number of services that could be put on in a parish church, and so provided a spiritual benefit for the living as well as for the departed. The chancel at Thompson is a very grand space. It is lit, or at least it was lit, by 5 large windows. And like the screen, the tops of these windows are filled with decorated naturalistic tracery. These windows and tracery would have originally been filled with coloured stained glass, but not a scrap of it remains. The enormous east window would have formed a glorious stained glass altarpiece for the high altar set below it. At some point, most probably in the 18th century, the 2 north windows and the tracery of all the other windows were blocked up with masonry. This was likely to save the cost of replacing or repairing the original medieval glass in these windows. It was much cheaper to block up windows with brick and with flint than to repair or replace old glass. The walls of the chancel would no doubt have been originally painted with a narrative wall paintings or even floral decoration like that on the screen, but all of this is now long gone. The chancel is now whitewashed in a gorgeous buttery yellow lime wash, which very much adds to the subtle beauty of this church building. The remnants of the furnishings used for the Catholic liturgy by the college priests are still very much in evidence in the chancel. On the south side of the altar are a set of 3 seats called a sedilia, which would have accommodated the priest, the deacon and the subdeacon during a celebration of High Mass at the high altar. This is a gloriously flamboyant mid-14th century piece, each seat topped by a flowing arch called an ogee, and between each seat in the spandrels are the faces of a trio of green men with the leaves sprouting from their mouths. It is for this luxuriant foliage and the naturalistic flamboyance I've mentioned before that the decorated style of architecture gets its name. Beside the sedilia to the east is a smaller niche, and this is a piscina, a sink in which the silver vessels used at Mass would have been cleaned. In the chancel are a couple of battered old chests, one bound with iron and the other with a curved top. They're both medieval. The one with the curved top is typical of the sort of chests imported in vast numbers into East Anglia through the Baltic Sea trade. These chests have likely stood in this chancel since the late Middle Ages, and very probably contained the silver investments used during the celebration of the Mass in this wonderful collegiate space. Another tantalising link to the medieval past are the crosses neatly scratched into the plaster of the chancel, some of which are filled with red paint. These are consecration crosses, and they were engraved on the walls at the time of the church's consecration in the 14th century. When the church was complete and was consecrated in the 3rd quarter of the 14th century, the Bishop of Norwich would have solemnly attended and would have anointed these spots with oil of chrism to consecrate this church building. There would have been 12 of these crosses originally throughout the church building. If you turn round from the sedilia to look to the west and towards the rood screen, you'll notice that there are 2 sets of seating on the north and south walls. These are the battered remains of the original choir stalls that were put in place in the 14th century to accommodate the priests of the college during their services. They have tip-up seats, which have on their bottom little ledges. These are known as Misericords. The word misericord means to have mercy, and these ledges allowed the clergy the relative mercy of propping themselves up when standing for the long services in the chancel. Misericords were usually decorated, and here They're decorated with little heads or with the coat of arms of the founders of the college, the de Chardalots. Going back through the screen into the nave, and in contrast to the chancel, this is filled with furnishings from after the English Reformation and the dissolution of the college, when the nave of medieval churches were fitted out for the offices of matins and evensong in the Book of Common Prayer and for the preaching and hearing of sermons. The benches, with their faux medieval bench ends, what are termed poppy heads, in the nave, all date from the early years of the 17th century. The most dominating furnishing in the nave is the early 17th century pulpit. Here, in the bottom two tiers, the parson and the parish clerk acted as a double act and would say the offices of the Book of Common Prayer before the parson ascended to the top tier to preach his sermon. The canopy over this lovely bit of Jacobean woodwork is called a sounding board or tester and is a rudimentary form of amplification system. All of these features, both medieval and post-Reformation, add to the complexity and atmosphere of this lovely old Norfolk church. It is a place that feels imbued with generations of prayer and has a depth to it. And the quietness of this space, one can almost imagine the priests of the College of Thompson propped up on the Misericords in their stalls in the chancel, singing plain song. Thanks very much for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.